All right. Well, one after, we'll get started to make sure we're making the most use of the time. Thanks for joining, Brian. Thanks for joining, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about marketing measurement in a post-cookie era, learnings from FanDuel and Hulu. Post-cookie era is a very funny one of the way I think about marketing is generally there's pre-iOS 14.5 and there's post-iOS 14.5. These are the two states of the world. Maybe we can touch on Google's decision to push back cookie deprecation a little bit. But I want to really highlight more on your journey, kind of your experimentation, the way you think about growth marketing, the focus on incrementality, and the way you use these types of tools. Quickly, Brian, do you want to do a quick introduction for yourself before we dig in?
Sure. Brian Borkowski, Senior Vice President of Marketing at FanDuel. I oversee most of the marketing functions, with the exception of brand and creative. I have all of acquisition, retention, marketing, team and league partnerships, talent, and MarTech and operations. I have been at FanDuel, it'll be 3 years in July. It's been a crazy ride. Before FanDuel, I was Vice President of Media and Subscriber Acquisition. Was really there through the growth period of Hulu. I think we went from 8 million to 40 million subscribers during my time there, which was just an amazing place. One of the best company cultures I've ever been a part of. I pretty much tell that to everyone I know. But prior to Hulu, I spent 7 years of my career in insurance. I led digital marketing for Farmers Insurance. A bit of an entrepreneur at heart as well. So I started my own insurance lead generation business, sold that company and became the CMO of Verikai, which was a predictive analytics startup in the insurance space that just sold last January. So, get the entrepreneurial bug every now and again, but, very much a growth marketer at heart. But, like I said, coming up on 3 years of FanDuel, I looked at sports betting as where kind of streaming was even 10 years ago. Cord cutting was accelerating, streaming was really taking off. And now with sports betting becoming legal federally in 2018, states have continued to legalize it. And, we're live in 22 states, including Washington, D.C. now. So it's just been a rocket ship of growth and a lot of fun and, a lot of challenging things to navigate as well. But that's what keeps you on your toes and makes it exciting.
Which kind of brings me the place I want to get started is when, you and I met when I was a data scientist at Google and you were leading acquisition at Hulu, and you became really interested in incrementality. And I was sort of known as the incrementality person internally at Google, building out whether conversion lift infrastructure, or geo lift infrastructure, and working with your teams. When we started working on this was pre-iOS 14.5. I'm curious, I have a two-part question is what led you down the road of, advanced experimentation and incrementality? And then a quote I'm going to quote you on for later to talk about is you're one of the few marketers who said, I'm happy that iOS 14.5 happened and giving different competitive advantages for businesses. I'm curious of both sides of that is how did you go down this road and how do you view, the evolving privacy landscape as an opportunity for sophisticated growth marketing?
Yeah, great question. Look, I consider myself an incredibly curious marketer. I'm always trying to learn. I'm a lifelong learner. I never pretend to know everything. And the one thing that really bothered me, even pre-iOS 14, and we had a ton of data at our disposal. We could see every time someone viewed an ad, clicked on an ad, came to the website and signed up. But the reality is that the customer journey isn't linear, right? They're consuming media across a number of different touch points, and Facebook will tell you here's how many people viewed your ad, clicked on your ad, and came to your website and signed up. Google may tell you the same thing. They're probably both taking credit for the same conversion. And I really wanted to understand, and really at Hulu, it was at such scale. We were signing up tens of thousands of people every single day. And at that level of scale, and had a tremendous brand. And at that level of scale, you start to question, okay, are my marketing efforts actually bringing in incrementally more people, or am I just getting in front of people who were going to sign up anyway? So is that last touch or multi-touch or whatever attribution model you're using, is that actually informative of how well that media is working to get new people in the door and not people that were already going to sign up and were already in the consideration set? So it was that curiosity, I think, that led me to think more about incrementality testing. And luckily enough, at the time, most of the platforms were going down the same path and developing their own methodology and their own way of doing incrementality testing within the platform. So um, we decided to really lean in. And it's a different way of thinking, I think, from how I had traditionally come up through marketing. I was used to just looking at a CPA and had a CPA target assigned to me and was just trying to get as many people as I could for whatever that CPA target was. So it was a change in mindset, but ultimately something we decided to lean into because the platforms were leaning into it as well, and it really helped accelerate. It's just once you get a taste of it, right? You see a few good results. It gets everybody excited and makes you lean in even more.
Yeah, the way I joke about it is you sort of can't unsee the things you see when you go down the incrementality journey of like, and I don't know if you remember this, but I remember I have just a weird memory for numbers. But like I remember when we were delivering the first ever incrementality test at Hulu you ran with Google, and I because we were nervous of like it was a $4,000 CPIA. And it's like, well, like, why don't we just shut down the business if that's the cost of acquisition? And I remember
Yeah.
like you did such a good job championing the team internally of like, it's fine for it to be 4,000. The goal is for how do we make it 1,500? Like it is a completely different framing of, value internally. And, you've been getting these CPAs, you're spending 120, probably $120 million a year in search. And it's like, that looks great from like a heuristic CPA standpoint. But if it's not actually driving the business and like we were able to make that transition and bring it down even further. And I think that journey is a lot of, the cultural components of how do you go down this route and what does it look like to actually start optimizing on experiments and making your models fit in with that.
Yeah, and as I get very much into the weeds and media mix modeling and really trying to figure out different ways of measurement. And one of the outputs of any media mix model is going to tell you what your base level of sales that you would get, regardless of if you were doing marketing at all, right? And I think it was. I'm going to age myself here, but I think it was John Wanamaker that said, 50% of my marketing dollars don't work. I just don't know what 50%. So it just led me down this path of trying to figure out, okay, how do I isolate the base sales I was going to get regardless of my marketing investment, and really trying to figure out the things that are going to drive incremental conversions overall.
Yeah, and I think like touching on MMM, like I think that's a really good case of like how do you think about experimentation and MMM? Like where do certain pieces fit in? As you're thinking about like I think one of the things that's kind of tricky is like there's larger state like there's certain cases that make a lot of sense for an MMM. There's certain cases where like the business might not support it as well. It doesn't quite do as well. Like how do you think about experimentation versus MMM or like broadly speaking like a measurement stack?
Yeah. Um, a media mix model is a great tool to help you with forecasting, budget setting, to really understand how much should we spend this year, right? And what should we expect to get for that spend? And then it gives you some things of here's what your optimal mix might be across channels. Here's how you might be willing to flight your spend throughout the year. Here's where you should lean in for because of seasonality, et cetera. So it gives you kind of a high level blueprint of how to go to market with your media spend. The thing with them with the media mix model though is it's only indicative of what you've done historically, right? And I'll give a basic example, but let's say we've been buying lookalike audiences in Facebook historically for the last 3 years. That's all really the media mix model knows. It doesn't know anything different. So what the media mix model is going to tell you or how much you should invest in Facebook is only based on how you've done historically. And I'm a big proponent or fan of saying, If we're not beating what the media mix model is telling us, then we're actually just not getting any better. So I look at it as a high level blueprint and really a guide from a planning perspective of how much we should spend, where we should spend based on what we've done historically. And then testing is the key component that helps you optimize and improve the performance, not only on an individual channel by channel basis, like that's a lot of the testing that we do, um, but even in certain channels that you have never spent before, right? Like marketing is always evolving. There's going to be something new. TikTok wasn't around a few years ago. So when a new type of inventory comes up, you don't really know how much of it's going to be incremental. You're going to have to spend over a long period of time in order to get it into the media mix model. So incrementality testing became the only way to really validate that new channel. But then, it also allows you to it allows you to validate things that the media mix model is telling you, right? If, like I said, it's based on history. There's some channels that you might not have spent to really aggressive levels in historically, and you might believe there's a lot of headroom there. So you can say, okay, the media mix model is recommending this mix. What if I shift it and I really heavy up in these channels and do a completely different mix? I can just run an experiment now with that new mix and validate, is that better than what I've done historically? And then we take those results and feed them back into the media mix model and change our response curves. And then when we rerun simulations, now we have the new, more effective tactics on each channel, or even the new, more effective mix that the media mix model can account for, and then and ideally end up allocating more budget to.
Yeah, I think the calibration is a really good point, because like something that I've seen, like again, another area where you've done a really good job is like when you talk to companies, often they'll be like, oh yeah, we do testing, we do experimentation, but it's like sometimes I think about it like in the Matrix, there's like the blue pill and the red pill of like you don't know how deep this world goes, of like what does it look to like to really get it right? How confident do you need to be? Like sometimes, like something I also talk about sometimes is like I think there's like a general like a horseshoe theory of people's understanding of confidence intervals and how much they matter, like statistical significance, is like when you talk to people who don't know almost anything about marketing or like about statistics, they don't care at all. You talk to people who like kind of know and like they're around it, they care a lot. And then you talk to like world-class PhDs, they're like, that's not a really good tool for decision making. Like that's not how you make decisions. It's how it's like might be how you evaluate a randomized controlled trial in medicine when the cost of being wrong is like giving drugs to someone that could kill them accidentally. But it's not necessarily like, we in the world of marketing are just we're trying to be Billy Bean in Moneyball. We are like, how do we use these dollars? How do we deploy them in the most efficient way? And if you can just make a large number of 70% sure decisions, 80% sure decisions, it's very different than needing to be 99% sure. Although we have made some of those experiments before where like we moved hundreds of millions of dollars after many experiments validating and continually validating to really be sure of what we're doing.
Yes, and that's the type of marketer I was. Like I very much lean into data and analytics and love to roll up my sleeves and get into the weeds. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a data scientist. But I was always asked the same question of, is that stat sig, right? And do we believe that the control and test groups, there was no contamination between the two? And we'd always look for, how do we have the perfect test construct? And did we run it over a long enough period of time in order to reach stat sig? And did we have the right cooldown period? And the challenge became, how do you increase velocity of testing when you're doing it that way? And I love the analogy you always give to a pharmaceutical drug that we don't, we're not curing cancer. We don't need 95% stat sig in order to give somebody a type of medication. And I don't, and I also not a big believer that media is as fragile as people think it is, right? Like if you turn off a channel for 2 weeks, and obviously it depends on the size of your business and a lot of other factors, but if you turn off a channel or scale it back for 2 weeks, it's not going to have this massive impact on your business overall, especially if you have a pretty well-known brand. Maybe for some smaller brands that are only spending in a few channels, it might be a bit more risky. But I'm not a big believer that it's that sensitive. And I think that the more you can take big swings and really accelerate the velocity of your testing, the faster you're going to improve and the better you're going to get over time. Because it's not about, you're not looking for the one big win experiment. You'll find them every now and again, and they're great to celebrate. And the execs love to know that you ran this one big experiment and saved X amount of dollars or reallocated X amount of dollars. But the gold is really in how do you rapidly test an experiment, because in aggregate, in what you total up all the tests that you've done and the results and the improvements that you make, you'll see overall CPAs coming down, and just getting much better, and hopefully as a marketer getting more money to spend because you're getting so much more efficient.
I think I think so many things you said resonate, and I think are just exactly right. Is like, there are definitely businesses that are more sensitive to like turning something off or changing something. Like, certainly less true with larger companies. But the way I always think about it is like, what is the cost of not knowing? Like, because you're also just spending a lot. Like, there is an unseen cost there of, you and I have both seen this many times, of like businesses spending hundreds of millions of dollars on things that were not driving quantifiable incremental returns. And so it's like, sometimes it's scary of like, oh, we're going to make this change, but that's also hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars that could be reallocated into other channels that drive significant value, can like materially impact the top line or the bottom line. So I think with all of these things, like, I think there's a question of like, what is the cost of testing, but also what is the cost of not testing? And I think that's where, like, why I wanted to found Haus originally was I wanted to lower those barriers. I wanted to lower those costs, because like we saw how much effort it would to get things up and running in a high quality way that worked across networks. And I don't know if you remember this, but like one of the geo experiments you and I think ran first was actually, in retrospect, a kind of poorly constructed test, because which is also like how
Don't tell
hard.
me that.
Well, it's like how hard testing is we did a geo test in search, but we were including Disney brand terms, and because like Hulu sat under the Disney umbrella, and we had Anaheim and Orlando in the treatment group, and it's like it makes it a little like, we're able to get through it, but it meant there's a lot of noise. And like, that's also the complexity of like, when things like that happen, then you need very significant data science deep dives, and like how you kind of automate around that. But like, one of the things I'm really curious about, because I think, again, like when people ask me about you, I think like one of the things you've done such a great job of is getting organizations to believe in a culture of experimentation. Because often, if you're the channel manager on a specific account, like, it can be really scary to do a big test in your channel. Like, what if it's not working? What do I do? Like, how does my how is my job impacted? I'm curious, like, what have been some of the lessons you've learned about at Hulu, FanDuel, Farmers, of getting people to embrace data and to think about this in a different way?
It's a really great question, and it is it's honestly the most challenging part of all of this is driving cultural change. And I've always told the story of, before the internet came around, most of marketing was buying TV, out of home, radio, and print ads for the most part, right? And that was very difficult to measure, and that's why you did a lot of quantitative or qualitative based measurement of like, here's my survey based of measuring brand awareness, measuring consideration, favorability, etc. And then the internet comes around, all of a sudden we have all this data at our disposal, and it's okay, all that's going to be performance marketing, and then everything else that we can't really measure is going to be brand. And I've always been a big believer in that we should measure everything, right? It's all performance. That's why we're doing marketing, to drive sales at the end of the day, right? And we should try to validate that and measure it all as effectively as we possibly can. And that's a complete mind shift for brand marketers. It's even a different mind shift for performance-based marketers to think about incrementality versus an in-channel CPA, as I mentioned earlier, as I did early in my career. And it helps to be in a position of authority where I can help, push this down and drive it within the team. I think the hardest part is changing the mindset of the team members to get them to understand and think about incrementality first and foremost before they are over what the platform KPIs are telling them. But the biggest challenge overall, honestly, is getting executive buy-in and saying, like, we have different metrics that we're optimizing towards now. And as marketers, we're storytellers, right? And I think you need to get that story right of how you're going to take it to your team, to the executive level, have all your ducks in a row of here's the reasons why we're going down this path. Here's what I think it can do. A lot of this early on when I first started doing it, primarily at Hulu, I didn't know if this was going to work and if this was going to drive more efficient CPAs at the end of the day. And it really helped to get a couple of wins under my belt first. Mm-hmm. And then I could go to the executive team and say, look, we're changing how we're doing things. We're not focused on a CPA anymore. We're really thinking about incrementality and an incremental CPA. We introduced a new KPI, a new metric, and shared the quick wins that we had already observed and showed how we were getting more efficient over time by taking this new approach. So, it wasn't perfect. You get a lot of skeptics. It goes against what a lot of people have learned throughout their career. Most people that have come up through the brand world in particular, get a little bit antsy when you're telling them you're going to measure their efforts more effectively. But I think when people begin to see the results and you can show that the proof is in the pudding, it gains credibility, it gains trust. And I think it's just really taking people along the journey with you and not operating in a silo and just assuming everyone knows what you know. Because it's and overly communicating how you're approaching it is my advice of how to drive cultural change in any organization.
Yeah, you said a number of things that just really resonate with me of like, making this cultural change. There will be really big wins, but it's like optimizing and like a culture of like, we are always testing, we are always experimenting, we're figuring things out kind of as we go. And, like getting the team to buy in. Because I think like fundamentally, just getting people to realize that this is data that they should be looking at, like, and even like easing into how you start optimizing with like, when you've been looking at a last click CPA for 10 years, and then you see this totally different data set, just like, whoa, like, how do I start moving to that immediately? Like, that might not be the right transition, but it's like, hey, we're going to start looking at it as well. And then you start like, oh, we're doing things that make this number look better. Like, how do you start to make those types of changes? And then when you make those changes, it can calibrate your MMM models. It can calibrate a lot of the other tools that you're. But like one other kind of like thing that came to mind is you mentioned like, a higher rate of experimentation. And I think FanDuel is a really interesting example of a company where like you guys have an amazing data science team, you have an amazing analytics team. What has working with a company like Haus kind of meant for you guys? Of like, I have my theory on this, but like you guys are in that category of company where like if you invested the resources appropriately, like you could definitely do more of this type of work on your own. What has it meant to work with us, and kind of what has the value been for you?
So many different things. First and foremost, I've always said that, and this isn't in every case, but most data scientists are not marketers, and most marketers are not data scientists. And there's always a bit of this gap. And because like when you're evaluating any type of experiment or trying to structure any type of experiment, you really need to understand, how is the platform handling this different way of targeting? How do I set this up appropriately? There's a lot of knowledge of media and marketing that is beneficial to the data scientists and how they would approach structuring any type of experiment. And subsequently, as a marketer, and then most, as I said, most marketers are not data scientists. You don't really understand how to construct an experiment. It goes back to what we said earlier. I'm like, oh yeah, just find two like-for-like markets and reach stat sig, and we're good to go. And it's not quite that simple. So Haus has really bridged the gap for us between marketing and the data science team. You guys have a phenomenal team of marketers who have been focused on incrementality for a long time in their career. and have really helped bridge that gap. And also very much helped drive cultural change. It's, having your team sitting and walking us through how you guys think about experimentation, how you guys analyze the results and do that differently than than we would have historically by trying to reach that SIG, got us thinking a lot differently. And then, recommending certain tests that you guys have seen work elsewhere that we should try. That builds confidence, it builds trust in you guys, and ultimately, like when we first started, I always tell the story of I asked my team to come up with a few different experiments, and I think I had a list of like 5 or 6, and I'm like, this is all we have. Like we're spending a ton of money, and I have a team of 220 marketers and I'm like, we should have hundreds of experiments. If all I could think of was at my time at Farmers Insurance and how curious I was, I would have came right to my boss with 50 different experiments if he asked me that, of all the things I was curious about. And what's been great to see is I think as we got a few early quick wins, and over time, House and what we do with you guys has become the new shiny object, right? Everybody wants to be involved. We're getting experiments not only just from my marketing team, but from the brand marketing team and the offer strategy team. So now, ideas and now we have a backlog of probably endless ideas that we'll never get through. So it's been very cool to see it change the culture. And at the end of the day, I personally have learned so much from the House team in how to increase velocity of testing, how to drive cultural change, and just a better way of doing things than we've always done historically.
Yeah, I think it's like the points you had, I think are exactly right. Of like general data science machine learning is very different than marketing measurement, where we're hyper interested in counterfactuals. Like my partner is an AI researcher. And when I was explaining this to her originally, she's like, why don't you just throw a neural network at it? And the problem is the data quality is low. Like you don't know what is causing, it is a hyper specialization in causal inference. That's something we've also talked about of like, I don't think people are talking about causal inference in the world of marketing before House, but I think it's a really good transition. So
the other point I would just add to Zach is that, like you said, we do have an incredibly talented data science team. And there's big business problems that I really want them focused on. I don't, want to staff up a whole nother team of resources to just be focused on testing when I have a company like House who it's all you guys do, right? And you guys live and breathe it every single day. You're not just trying to sell us some new cool product that you guys came out with. You guys are really focused on solving a real world problem, and are passionate about doing so. So it's a lot easier for me to just partner with you guys and run our experiments through you, and then get my data science team focused on really the bigger problems and challenges that we're trying to solve internally.
Yeah, I think that's something people don't totally understand when they work with us is like we live to make our models 0.25% better. Like we have PhDs in synthetic control who this is the only thing they want to do is make our models slightly better. Where like, there's the cutting edge, there's a bleeding edge. And the way we think about it is like there's a new edge that's kind of being created by House, and we want to stay there for like all of our customers will stay there forever. So
that's right. And I couldn't hire a Zach Epstein to run my own internal analytics team that's going to be driving that same mentality, right? So there's definitely a tremendous amount of value to partnering with somebody like House versus trying to do it internally yourself.
Amazing. Well, like to quickly wrap up, like this was amazing. Yeah, as expected, this was awesome. Thanks for your time, Brian. Just to like one quick question that came up, and then wrapping up. So quickly to wrap up, our next open house is with Connor Dalt from Caraway, who's again also amazing. We're going to be talking about his marketing's impact on Amazon, how Caraway has looked at like understood omni-channel insights using the House platform of like how do their ads with Meta drive sales to Amazon or to other channels. But the last question in the Q&A that came up was, how do you think about Sorry, the question for Brian, but I can dig into like, how do you think about accounting for time horizons and experiments versus an MMM or a brand consideration cycle for purchase is longer? So how do you think about like long-term purchase consideration cycles versus versus like, what you get out of a discrete experiment? And I have a very technical answer to this question.
This is a really good question. And look, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that just because you tested something today doesn't mean it's going to hold true 6 months from now. So you always want to continue to retest and validate even old tests that you've done. Because things change, right? Your brand becomes, awareness grows, your brand becomes more known, and things change that could affect the output and how incremental certain efforts are. But when, I'm a big believer that you're not going to invest, most CFOs or even CEOs are not going to be willing to invest a ton of money now in hopes that, and just focused on growing brand awareness in hopes that sales are going to follow. I think the reality is understanding your MMM can help you understand as your brand continually grows and evolves and becomes bigger, how is that impacting sales more holistically? But I look at testing as understanding how impactful is my brand now in the moment. And that's why I'm a big fan of always kind of revalidating, retesting, and going back to the well when you think something may have shifted or your brand has gotten bigger over time. So there's no shortage of things to test, continually validate. And I think focusing on how are we driving sales now and seeing how that changes over time is incredibly important.
Yeah, my like two quick things to add here is I completely agree with everything you said. Through a system like Haus, we're able to support post-treatment windows. So we can extend the quote unquote cooldown period to see if there's latent effects of advertising, almost like from an ad stock perspective in the experiment. Is it driving some outcome afterwards? But also when I have to be vague about what exactly I did on this at Google, but I've looked into this very, very rigorously. And what I found that was even if you hold a persistent holdout, 90 days, 180 days, you're not materially changing the percentage lift of that experiment. Yeah, that like it could persist a little bit over time, bringing down a CPIA, but the general effectiveness of that channel is very, very unlikely to change over a longer time horizon, holding things constant for a longer period. So we were able to find that like in 30-day experiments or 28 days and potentially even shorter, you're able to get the outcomes that are generally correct. Well, thank you for joining, Brian. This was awesome as expected. Really appreciate all of your insights and being a great partner to Haus, and excited for more testing.
Thanks for having me, Zach, and thanks for being a great partner.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.